Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of True Crime with Caitlyn. Today we're going to be talking about a serial killer, a man who murdered 4 women within the space of 8 days during World War II. He took advantage of the darkness that fell over London during the Blitz and committed murders so heinous that he was compared to the infamous Jack the Ripper. This is the case of the Blackout Ripper. Before I start, I just want to quickly pre-warn you that so much happens in this case in such a short period of time, and a lot of it is all happening at once. So I am going to try my best to relay the case onto you in a way that's easy for you to follow and to understand. So if I sort of go back and forth with dates and details and stuff like that, you understand why. So, in September 1939, the UK was officially at war with Germany, the beginning of World War II. The Blitz began on what was dubbed Black Saturday on the 7th of September 1940, where German bombers would fly over London, dropping bombs for 57 nights straight, which killed thousands of people. As a way to try and make it more difficult for the German bombers to target different areas of the UK, and the UK in general, the UK entered into the blackout, leaving the streets in almost complete darkness. Blackout blinds and dark-coloured fabrics were put up in the windows, all head and rear lights on cars had to be put out, it was very dangerous to drive, street lights were off, and I read that the rules were actually so strict that you couldn't even smoke a cigarette or light a match when you were outside in case the flickering light could be seen by a German bomber. History was never my strong suit unless it was Tudor history, but something that always stuck with me about the blackout was just how terrifying that must have been to live through. The infamous alarm, the pitch black, having to race to a bomb shelter and hearing the bombs and the destruction that they caused. Those people must have been incredibly strong to have lived through that. During the blackout, crime went up by 50%. If you were lucky to not have your home reduced to rubble, by the time you got back to your home, it was likely that thieves would have already ransacked it. There were many assaults, rapes and murders, and with a reduced police force, most of the men off fighting in the war, the officers were simply outnumbered and had far too much of a workload. It was early in the morning on the 9th of February 1942 when an electrician was walking down Montague Place, Marylebone, central London, past the air raid shelters when he noticed a torch lay on the floor at one of the entrances. This was the type of torch that pretty much everyone carried so that they could find their way from A to B when it was dark. Curious as to why this torch was on the floor, he walked through and into the air raid shelter, and that is where he would discover the body of 41-year-old Evelyn Hamilton. Evelyn Margaret Hamilton was born on the 8th of February 1901 in Tyne-and-Wear. She was a northerner. She came from a working class family, her dad being a coal miner, and she was one of 7 children. Evelyn was described by one of her sisters as, quote, her only hobby in life was to improve her knowledge and mind on all subjects. So it was no surprise that Evelyn was very intelligent. She graduated from the University of Edinburgh at 22 years old with degrees in both chemistry and pharmacology. She eventually moved from the north down to Romford, Essex, where she worked as a chemist. Evelyn wasn't really a social butterfly. In fact, she was a bit of a loner and was fiercely independent. She didn't really have any friends, just colleagues at the chemist who would describe her as eccentric. She clashed with her colleagues quite a lot. She was a very very strong woman in a male-dominated field. She never had any boyfriends, so there was no husband and no children. Sadly, on her 41st birthday, which was the day before her body was discovered, Evelyn was let go from her job at the chemist. They had simply fallen on hard times financially because of the war. She was wished the best of luck and was sent off with 1 month's wage. I don't know if Evelyn had some sort of inkling that this was going to happen, because she had already secured another job as a manager in a chemist in Grimsby. Evelyn would travel into central London, where she was going to spend a couple of nights before taking the train up to Grimsby to start her new job. She checked into a boarding house at around about 10:30 p.m, asked the landlady if she had any recommendations for somewhere to grab some nice food. She left around midnight and headed out, never to return. When her body was discovered inside of the dingy, damp air raid shelter, she was laid on the cold, wet ground. Her t-shirt was torn, exposing one of her breasts, which had bloody scratches on it, and her underwear were also torn. Her autopsy would show that she had been manually strangled to death, the killer gripping his hands around her throat with so much force that her larynx was bruised on both sides. The bruises that were prominent on Evelyn's throat suggested that her killer may have been left-handed. This is something that you'll hear me say quite a lot through this episode. Evelyn was covered black and blue in bruises. There were no signs of any sexual assault and also no defensive wounds discovered. It was almost as if the killer had taken Evelyn completely off guard. At this moment in time, the police had no idea who Evelyn was. Her bag that was discovered close by her was empty of any identification and of any money. We now know in hindsight that Evelyn had at least £80 in cash. She always carried large amounts of cash. She didn't trust banks. So with inflation, that would be around about £3,500 today. So could robbery have been the motive for Evelyn's murder? Officers would conduct door-to-door inquiries, presenting the people who answered with a photo of Evelyn, asking if anyone recognised her, but no one did. Again, she wasn't from central London. Finally, the officers arrived at the boarding house, where the landlady did recognise Evelyn and was able to name her. It was theorised that after leaving the restaurant that the landlady had recommended, the killer pounced on Evelyn from behind so unexpectedly and so quickly that she didn't even have time to scream before her throat was being squeezed by strong hands. It would have been pitch black, stupid o'clock in the morning. Maybe Evelyn was distracted rummaging around for her torch when she was targeted. Small scratches on her shoes indicated that there was a very slight struggle, but of course we know that the killer was able to overpower Evelyn, squeezing the life out of her, stealing her cash and leaving her body to be discovered inside of the air raid shelter. Officers would have never imagined that the discovery of Evelyn's body was the beginning of a week-long bloodshed by a sadistic killer. On the morning of the 10th of February, some meter readers arrived at 153 Wardour Street, Soho, to collect some money out of the meters which powered the electricity and the heating, etc. This building contained a couple of apartments/rooms that the residents lived in. A woman named Ivy shared an apartment with 34-year-old Evelyn Oatley, although the way I understand it was that the women lived separately, so Evelyn had her own room, her own meter, but the women shared a kitchen. I read one time that Evelyn had brought home a couple of nice steaks and that she cooked them for herself and Ivy in their kitchen, so I guess maybe it was a bit like a room share type thing. When the men arrived, Ivy allowed them in to collect the money from her meter, but she hadn't heard Evelyn pottering about that morning, so believing that she was still asleep, she gently knocked on the door to try and awake her. After a couple of minutes, one of the men would open the door, and in the darkness, Evelyn's blackout curtain still being shut, he flicked on his torch and saw a horrific scene. Evelyn was born Evelyn Judd on the 5th of April 1908 in Earby, Lancashire. Despite being a small town girl, Evelyn had big dreams. She wanted to be a star, dreaming of a life on London's West End stage. She was a beautiful, talented singer, dancer, and actor who just oozed passion and enthusiasm. She wanted to be an entertainer. However, something would stop Evelyn in her tracks. At only 15, she is of course unmarried, she would fall pregnant. After giving birth, her baby would be adopted by a Canadian couple. As you can imagine, this was a lot for Evelyn, who is very young, being pregnant at such a young age, having a life grow inside of her, having to go through labour, which is not the most pleasant thing, and after having the baby, having to hand it over, give it up for adoption, never being able to watch this baby grow. All of this alongside the shame that Evelyn would have felt for one, falling pregnant, and two, having a baby outside of marriage would have been a huge thing for her to deal with. She would go on to marry farmer Harold Oatley and worked with him on his chicken farm in Blackpool for just over a year, but her dream was still calling out to her. Harold supported his wife and allowed her to move down to London to chase her dreams, but sadly she moved around 1938, and just as she got her foot in the door on the West End, the war began, and acting opportunities for Evelyn, who was now going by the alias Lita Ward, became non-existent. She worked as a showgirl slash naked dancer to get by before ultimately turning to sex work. She would be described as a happy, joyful, vibrant young woman who was a girl's girl and would do anything for her friends. She was extremely likeable. On the evening of the 9th of February, so this is the same day that Evelyn Hamilton's body was discovered, Evelyn Oatley was working the streets hoping to find a customer who would accompany her that evening. Despite living with Ivy, Evelyn was terrified of sleeping alone. That night, Ivy would see Evelyn bring back a customer, this customer being an airman. When she got into her bedroom, Evelyn flicked on the radio and Ivy got the signal. This meant that she was working, and so she finished off her cup of tea before going back into her own bedroom. Not too long later, because Ivy wasn't in a 100% deep sleep yet, Evelyn's radio would be turned up full whack, the music vibrating through the small apartment. Ivy debated for a little bit whether to go and knock on the door and ask Evelyn to turn it down, but knowing that Evelyn was working, she left it, and eventually the music went off. Ivy wouldn't hear another sound coming from Evelyn's room until the next morning, when the meter reader opened up the door and screamed. Evelyn was sprawled across her bed and she was naked. Her head was sort of hanging off the side of the bed, which exposed a huge wound across her neck. Her throat had been slit with a razor blade, which was found displayed next to her head. As Evelyn was on the brink of death, her killer tortured her, horrifically mutilating her. She had several cuts to the throat. She had at least 12 cuts to her genitals, alongside some injuries which were described as ragged. The killer had used a tin opener on her. Evelyn's own torch had been forced inside of her, and it was still inside of her when the police quickly arrived. At the scene, a pair of bloody curling tongs were found alongside the razor blade and the tin opener. Fingerprints extracted from the tin opener suggested that the killer may have been left-handed. When the fingerprints were taken, the expert tried to see if he could match them to any of the fingerprints that they had on their files, but unfortunately he couldn't. He could not name the man. Evelyn's bag was discovered, and just like Evelyn Hamilton, it was completely empty of any cash. Evelyn Oatley's cause of death would be determined to be from major hemorrhaging from the neck. Despite that being her cause of death, there was evidence that she had also been strangled. Initially, the officers didn't link the murders of both Evelyns together just because of how different the two crimes were. One woman was found outside in an air raid shelter and another was in her home. One was horrifically tortured and mutilated and the other wasn't. Plus, the cause of death was different for both of the women. Usually killers tend to stick with what they know and not really veer away from that. Unbeknownst to the police, by that evening, the killer of both women was back. He was out on the prowl, searching for another victim, and her body wouldn't be discovered until days later. Margaret Campbell Burkett grew up in Napier, New Zealand before moving to Hoxton, East London when she was still young. We don't really know a lot about Margaret's upbringing or her very early life, however we do know that by the time she was 21 she had been arrested and convicted of prostitution many times. She would end up in Southend-on-Sea where she found a job working in a gift shop. She and the owner of the gift shop, a man named Frederick Law, would actually get married only a couple of months after Margaret began working there. After this, Margaret would live a very comfortable life with Frederick. The couple bought a house and a car, which they used to go and travel in, and eventually either having or adopting a baby girl named Barbara. Life was good for Margaret, however, in 1932, her entire world flipped upside down. Frederick would become ill and sadly die, leaving behind Margaret and Barbara. Prior to his death, Frederick was actually declared bankrupt, and so in order to get by and not find themselves on the streets, in order to pay their bills and just be able to live, Margaret was forced to sell the business, which had been failing, sell the car and the house and even their furniture inside. That is how destitute they were. In 1934, Margaret made the very difficult decision that she thought was going to be best for Barbara and herself. She enrolled Barbara into a Southend-on-Sea boarding school, and then she moved into central London where she found work as a cleaner, hoping that once she was there she'd be able to find a better paying job. However, she would sadly struggle and again turned to sex work. Margaret would isolate herself away from the other sex workers as if she didn't want to be seen or associated with them. She would try her best to conceal that part of her life, even from the very few women that she befriended. These all thought that Margaret was a receptionist. Margaret would be dubbed the lady by some of the other girls who recognised her and knew her because of her demeanour, the way she spoke and the way she carried herself, and because of what she wore. She was described as dressing very conservative. Unfortunately, due to her work, Margaret would frequently be assaulted. While living in her flat on Gosfield Street, her neighbours would remember hearing almost constant fighting and arguing. On one occasion, one of the neighbours actually went to see what was going on and found a drunken Margaret being attacked in one of the hallways, crying out, quote, "Help, police, murder." Unfortunately, hearing altercations such as these wasn't unusual for Margaret's neighbours. She would be reluctant to go to the police to report these assaults, worried that she would be again convicted of prostitution, and she didn't want that getting back to Barbara. Everything that Margaret was doing, putting up with the assaults, working as a sex worker to try and get money, was with Barbara in her best interests. Every couple of weeks, Barbara would travel into London to visit her mother Margaret, and she always got so excited. They had so much fun together. They would go to the cinema, they would go on walks through either Hyde or Kensington Park, and if Margaret had the spare money, they would even do a little bit of shopping. On Friday the 13th, 15-year-old Barbara would arrive at her mother's flat on Gosfield Street at around about 4:30 p.m. She noticed a parcel sat outside of her mother's door, which had actually been there for 2 days. Barbara knocked and waited for Margaret to answer the door, beaming and opening her arms for a warm hug, but there was no answer. Barbara decided to go out and have a walk around the nearby area to see if she could spot her mum anywhere. However, it would be when she bumped into one of Margaret's neighbours that Barbara felt a chill go over her body. This neighbour told Barbara that no one had seen, heard or spoke to Margaret since the 10th, and that he had already contacted the police. When officers arrived, they would force entry into 43-year-old Margaret's flat, where they would discover her lay in bed covered in a blood-soaked sheet. A ligature was found tightly tied with a knot around her neck. She had severe bruising across her body. It looked like she had been horribly beaten prior to her death. Margaret's body had been left in a posed position, so her knees were bent and her legs were sort of pushed up, exposing a 10-inch gaping, jagged wound down her groin, a bread knife found displayed nearby the injury. She had been barbarically mutilated using several different table knives that the killer had left nearby each injury, the wounds being all across her thighs and her genitals. Her abdomen had been torn open, exposing Margaret's internal organs, and a wax candle had been forced into her vagina. Police would soon recover evidence from the scene, including the candlestick where the wax candle came from. On here they found right-handed fingerprints, which again made them believe that the killer was left-handed, him using his right hand to grip the holder and his left to pull the candle off. At her autopsy, it was determined that Margaret Law's cause of death was from manual strangulation. Because she had been last seen on the 10th, it was assumed that it was potentially that evening that Margaret was killed. Evelyn Oatley's body was discovered on the morning of the 10th. I believe that quite quickly Margaret and Evelyn Oatley's murders were linked because they were more similar than Evelyn Hamilton and Evelyn Oatley, and the police could not ignore that they had a maniac out there killing women, killing these sex workers who had brought him into their home, and the police had to catch him before he could strike again. But his reign of terror wasn't over, and the police had no idea that they already knew his name after one of his victims had survived an attack. On the evening of the 12th of February, 30-year-old Margaret Haywood left her home in Kingsbury and travelled to Piccadilly to meet with a friend. I've seen different sources give Margaret different names, such as Mary and Greta, which when you put them together almost sound like Margaret, so I don't know if they were nicknames, but from here on I'm going to refer to her as Greta, just so all of the similar names don't get confusing. Greta had planned to meet her friend, which was a man, in a bar, but she got there first, so she sat and awaited the friend arriving. This is when she would be approached by an airman offering to buy her a drink. Usually Greta wouldn't even entertain this, but the airman seemed charming and he was easy on the eye, so she accepted and he sat down beside her. He managed to convince Greta to leave this bar with him and go to another bar where they would grab a bite to eat as well. Once they were sat inside of this second bar, the airman's demeanour changed and he started acting really creepy, asking personal, direct questions such as where Greta lived and who she was intending to meet. He creepily asked her, quote, "Are you a naughty girl?" which Greta took incredibly offensive, telling him firmly that no, she, quote, wasn't that type of girl. She stood up thanking him for the drink but told him that she must leave, she was going to meet her friend, and he got up following her. As the two walked through the dark streets, the airman asked Greta for a goodnight kiss and if she knew if there was any air raid shelters nearby. She said that she didn't know and that even if she did, she wouldn't be going anywhere near one with him, knowing what he was hitting on at. As they continued walking, out of nowhere, the airman grabbed Greta and forced her into a dark doorway, dropping his gas mask so that he could wrap his hands around her throat. As he's squeezing, strangling her, Greta is trying to scream and trying to fight him off, but he has overpowered her. By some miracle, a young night porter hears some muffling coming from Upper Back Street, so he walks up to see what is going on, disturbing the airman, who in a panic fled. This was at around 9:45 p.m. A patrol officer would escort Greta to the police station to take a statement and also collected the gas mask that the airman left behind. A gas mask which had a serial number that led directly back to him. 15 minutes after attacking Greta, the airman would run into Catherine Mulcharney, a fiercely independent married woman who lived alone and provided for herself working as a sex worker. Catherine wasn't ignorant to how dangerous the work had become, especially with all of these new soldiers coming into London who were known to be violent with sex workers. And by now she was also aware of the murder of both Evelyns. In order to try and make her work the slightest bit safer, Catherine had access to two addresses. One was her home on Southwark Street, where she would take clients who she either knew, who were regulars, or someone that she was comfortable with. And then there was another address on Maple Arch, where she would take men who she wasn't 100% on. When the airman approached Catherine, straight away he was off. He asked her directly for her services. He didn't stop to kind of flirt a little bit or beat around the bush. He quickly agreed on her £2 fee, which again was a bit strange. Usually the soldier types would try to haggle, believing they were entitled to discounts, and he seemed frantic and out of breath. She decided to take the airman to the second address on Maple Arch, and the airman flagged down a taxi, which he paid for using a wad of notes that he flashed in front of Catherine. Once inside the taxi, he tried to make a move on her and she told him to stop it. He actually went so far that he put his head between her legs and she physically had to grab him by his hair and pull him back to stop him. Once they arrived at Maple Arch, the airman wasted no time undressing, not even waiting a couple of seconds for Catherine to put some money into the meter for some warmth and for some light. Catherine also undressed but left on her boots. Some reports say that she did this so that her feet wouldn't get wet or cold from the chilling damp floor. As Catherine is lay on the bed awaiting the airman to come into the bed, unexpectedly the airman pounces on her, slamming his knees into her stomach, knocking the air out of her before locking his hands around her throat, choking her. Catherine just managed to get the faintest whines out before the airman pressed onto her windpipe with his thumbs. Fighting for her life, Catherine clawed at the airman's wrists and tried to wriggle free, but his grip was like steel. It wouldn't loosen. Not until she brought up her feet and with everything she had booted him in the stomach, which knocked him flying. Probably running off adrenaline, Catherine flung herself out of bed and ran to a nearby apartment, banging on the door, begging for help, screaming, quote, "Murder, police, please let me in, save me, please, this man is trying to kill me." An elderly woman who lived opposite thankfully opened her door to Catherine, and the women, together, from behind the door, watched the airman as he rose to his feet and began redressing. He would eventually approach the door. The woman who lived there was armed with a vase to throw at him just in case, and when he got to the door, he threw £8 at Catherine, apologising, saying that he must have had too much to drink. So that is two women that this airman has attacked in one night. Two who survived, but sadly 24 hours later another woman's body would be discovered. Catherine contacted the police and described her attacker as being around 5'8" to 5'9" with a medium build. He was well spoken and clean shaven and had greeny grey eyes. That was all she was really able to offer up. They had met in the dark. The apartment room where she was attacked was also pitch black, so she didn't really get a good clear look at him. The officer speaking to Catherine confiscated all of her cash. She had about £10 and the £8 that the attacker had given her was kind of mixed in within that, so the money was taken as evidence and she was reimbursed. As Catherine was being attacked by the airman, the police were working on trying to identify who the gas mask that was left behind during Greta's attack belonged to. The officer contacted a corporal within the RAF and asked if they could search through their records and see who was linked to the gas mask with the serial number 525987, and it didn't take long for them to come back with a name. The gas mask belonged to 28-year-old Gordon Cummins, who just so happened to be out that evening and was still out well past him being due back. The officer asked the corporal to detain Gordon on his arrival back as they had connected him to the assault of a woman. Despite them now having his name and unknowingly that he is the active serial killer, they are now essentially laying in wait for him. It wouldn't be enough to save Doris Jeanette. Doris was born in Hartlepool, which is in the northeast of England, in 1903. Her mother was a single woman, Doris being born out of wedlock, and so Doris would be raised by both her mother and her auntie. Not much is reported about her upbringing, however she would be described as an educated, smart girl who was very glam. Her hair always looked good and nails were always done, and she loved to go shopping about, thrifting especially, looking for beautiful clothes to wear. She was very much a woman who cared about her appearance and always liked to look her best. At some point, Doris would move to London's West End and started going by the name Olga. She was partial to hanging out within luxurious hotels where she would meet many of her clients. Doris was a sex worker, and an expensive one. She would provide different services than the other regular sex workers, which included things such as BDSM style sex, dominance style, the use of whips and chains, etc. And for this, she would be paid very handsomely, often meeting her clients within the luxurious hotels and bougie bars, and she even took appointments over the phone. In September 1935, 32-year-old Doris would be spotted by 68-year-old Henry Junette, and it was love at first sight from both sides. He was said to have been swept off of his feet after seeing how beautiful she was. Henry went over to introduce himself, and 2 months later the couple would be married. Henry had a very successful career and was quite well off, meaning that Doris no longer had to do sex work, and sex work was something that Henry never wanted her to do again because he was going to look after her. However, after some time, the couple would fall on hard times financially. Henry became swallowed up in debt and the business was failing, which forced the couple to leave London and move in with Doris's mum, who was now living in Harrogate. Henry was determined to get himself back on his feet, and so he would eventually move back to London, and Doris would follow him, much to his frustration. After many years of marriage, she grew bored with the trad wife life that she was living, and so when Henry was returning back to London, there was nothing that was going to stop Doris from doing the same. Because no, she wasn't going to be staying in Harrogate and living with her mum and basically getting the pocket money of Henry to live on. Henry would eventually find a stable job within a hotel, and due to his work, he would often have to spend the night away from the flat that he and Doris shared at 187 Sussex Gardens. This didn't bother Doris though, because when Henry was out of sight, she could make her own money getting back into sex work. I believe that Henry did know that Doris did this, but it was like an unspoken thing between them. It was like the elephant in the room. On the afternoon of the 12th of February, so this is the day before Margaret's body was discovered, and the same day that Greta and Catherine were attacked, Doris and Henry sat and enjoyed a bowl of soup together before Doris walked Henry to the train station, waving him off as he left to go to work. Henry returned the following day, and before he even got into the door, he noticed something strange. Sat at the door was their milk delivery, so Henry must be at the door later in the afternoon or the evening time for it to be strange that the milk hadn't been taken in yet, assuming that the delivery comes on a morning. He let himself into the flat and called out for Doris, but there was no answer. As he walked through the flat, he noticed that in the kitchen, there were the soup bowls from their tea the night before, unwashed on the table. When Henry tried to go into the bedroom to see what was going on, he was stunned to find that the door was locked and the key was nowhere to be found. Panicked, he raced to a neighbour asking if they had seen Doris, which they hadn't, and together, worried sick, they contacted the police. When the officers arrived, they had to force entry into the bedroom, breaking down the door by kicking it in, to discover Doris's body. She was laid on and surrounded by bloodied sheets, and it was clear that she had been a victim to a heinous murder. Her body was extensively mutilated, specifically to her genitals. She had been stabbed and slashed all across her body, and the nipple on her left breast had been sliced and was partially separated from her breast. She had a 6-inch long carving wound to her stomach, and tied tightly around her neck and knotted was one of her stockings. Doris's autopsy would reveal that her cause of death was strangulation by ligature, and horrifyingly, some of the mutilations had happened while she was still alive. It would be around 4:30 a.m. that Gordon Cummins attempted to sneak back into his room when he was stopped. When he was told that the police were after him because they had found his gas mask at the scene of an attack, he lifted up his hand to show that he had a gas mask and it must have been some sort of mistake, or when he was at the pub maybe someone picked up his and he picked up theirs. Gordon was taken to his room and ordered to wait until the police arrived, which they eventually did, taking him down to the station for interrogation at 8 a.m. One of the interrogators noticed that Gordon had injuries, little cuts, maybe scratches on his fingers, and when asked how he got them, he said that they were from working on an engine. He claimed to have a, quote, hazy recollection of what he had been up to the past couple of hours, claiming that he had spent some time at a party. Police didn't believe his story about the swabbing of the gas masks or misplacing his, and so they arrested him for the assault of Greta Haywood. Little did they know they had just caught the madman who the press had dubbed the Blackout Ripper. Gordon Frederick Cummins was born on the 18th of February 1914 in New Earswick, North Yorkshire, being the oldest of 4 children from his parents John and Amelia. Gordon, who was very bright, was sent to a private school in Llandovery, South Wales, where the teachers would describe him as unremarkable. He was very social and spent more time chatting and hanging out with his friends than concentrating on his work. Despite this, he did go on to receive a diploma in chemistry at only 16 years old. He spent a couple of terms at Northampton College of Technology before dropping out when he was 18. Following this, he would jump from job to job to job, from place to place. He would be let off from most of his jobs due to his bad timekeeping. While working within the Royal Air Force, Gordon would marry Marjorie Stevens in December 1936. The couple lived in a flat on Westmoreland Road, Barnes, South West London, and they never had any children. When the war began, Gordon would often be away from home, being stationed all over the country, and when he was away, he would play. He acted like a bachelor, like an unmarried man, and would spend loads of time and money which he had got off of his wife, frequenting the clubs and the bar scene wherever he was. He was very charming, very good with women who naturally gravitated towards him and trusted him, no one having even an inkling of what he was capable of and what evil resided in him. The murders of Evelyn Hamilton, Evelyn Oakley, Margaret Lowe and Doris Junette had all been linked along with the attacks on Greta and Catherine. There was a lot of investigation that went into this and there was a lot of evidence, so I'm just going to kind of lay out the main points. Some of the evidence that investigators found either on his person, in his possessions, or could be linked to him included: in the kitchen area where Gordon lived, right at the back of a cupboard, there was a white metal cigarette case with the initials LW engraved into it. Inside of the cigarette case, there was a picture of either Evelyn Oakley or her mother. Quick reminder that Evelyn Oakley sometimes went by Letter Ward, LW. It was theorised that on the day he was arrested, during the couple of hours that he was sat in his room, he got rid of a lot of evidence, this cigarette case being one of them. So it's theorised that while he was sat there waiting for the police to come, he kind of ran around anywhere. It was quite easy. Some of his bunkmates said it was quite easy to get in and out of the room, so he went kind of spreading his quote-unquote trophies everywhere. Possessions that were identified as belonging to Doris were found. This included a black fountain pen with DJ engraved into it, and also a hair comb that had a broken tooth. These items were identified by Doris's husband. The cash that was given to Catherine after her attack had like a printing number or a serial number or something like that on it, and through extensive investigation, the investigators were able to match some of them notes up to Gordon. The men were all paid in cash, and they were able to link those serial numbers to the notes that Gordon would have got. Greta's phone number and her name were found scribbled on a bit of paper in his coat, and of course his gas mask was left at the scene of her attack. The gas mask would be what links him to Evelyn Hamilton's murder. Dust and dirt found on the gas mask was consistent with dust and dirt found inside of that air raid shelter. And also on the night of Evelyn Hamilton's murder, it had also snowed, and the killer had left behind prints from the sole of his shoe, and Gordon had removed the soles from a pair of his boots, probably because the pattern would link him, which eventually it did because the soles were discovered. His MO was quite consistent throughout, that being strangulation, and for several of the women, extensive mutilation. His fingerprints matched a fingerprint recovered from the candlestick from Margaret Lowe's murder, and fingerprinting was so new that at the trial the defence actually tried to throw out this bit of evidence. And the last one I'm going to mention, because like I say there is heaps and tons, is that Gordon Cummins was left-handed, and I've mentioned, like I said I would, quite a few times through this episode that a lot of the evidence pointed to the killer being left-handed. Gordon Cummins was charged with 4 counts of murder and 2 counts of assault. For some reason, maybe common practice back then, he was only tried for the murder of Evelyn Oatley. His trial began on the 24th of April 1942, where he entered a plea of not guilty. However, 4 days later, a jury of 12 men would find him guilty. Gordon maintained his innocence but was handed a death sentence. He was executed by hanging on the 25th of June 1942 at Wandsworth Prison. As his 2-minute execution took place, there was an active air raid. Gordon Cummins, the Blackout Ripper, is still suspected of being involved with the murder of another 2 women. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. Please make sure to follow the podcast wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Make sure to follow me on Instagram at TrueCrimeCaitlyn, where I'll be posting images relating to today's case and for any and all updates. I will see you all in 2 weeks' time for a brand new episode.